So we'll start with the first question, which is the most obvious question, which is how much should I raise and when? The answer, as you know, is it depends. And so what I want to do is walk you through more of sort of a high-level strategic rationale for how do you define, basically the bottom line that you need to know is how much money do I need? And Rowan will walk you through what are different scenarios if you raise too much or too little, and we'll get into those later on. But before we get into that, I'll walk you through how you decide on what you need. So the first example, I'll start with looking at in life sciences, just because this is a very simple way to understand value creation. So some of you are familiar with clinical trials for a therapeutic, and the way that valuation works with therapeutics is somewhat linear, potentially exponential, but it starts with, you've got a drug, you're able to validate the drug somehow, you take it into animals, then you do a phase 1 trial, phase 2, phase 3, and throughout this process, value is created along the way. But how does this apply to digital health? And so that's where you need to start thinking about. The first thing to think about is what are the value creation milestones for your digital health startup? So here are some examples of how you might think about that. And we've broken this out into 4 categories. So the first is product development, the second is user traction, customers and partners, and monetization financials. So let's start with product development first. A simple example is that you have an alpha product, or you have a beta product, or you've launched a particular set of functionality. So for example, let me pick a company that's out here. So for the Agile guys, you could say that we have 3 different disease states that are fully set up under our algorithm. That's sort of a milestone that you might have reached in your product. Or we've cataloged the top 90% of diseases that a cardiologist sees. And so, or conditions that a cardiologist sees. And so now we feel comfortable going to reach cardiologists, and that's sort of our target market. So that is a clear relationship between a product functionality or a product that you've reached and value to the company. Okay. Another important one that we see in a lot of companies, and particularly at the Series A stage and beyond, is understanding what the health economic value is of a company. And so if you're looking to change behavior, if you're looking to save costs in other ways, everybody knows healthcare costs are they're increasing very rapidly, and so the types of things that are going to work in the future are decreasing healthcare costs. And so you need to show that to get the traction down the road, and so that's an important part of the product. Looking at user traction, I think most of the room is very familiar with this, but the typical stats that you look at, it's not necessarily, if you're a consumer company, then you can look at some of the tech benchmarks, but if you're a more healthcare specific company, if you're a B2B sales company, engagement is a very important part of the user traction. Understanding how much users are, how often they're coming back. Something as often as once in a month can be very meaningful depending on what it is that your product does. So think very specifically to what your product does. A third area is customers and partners. If you're selling into businesses or self-insured employers, understand, having your first self-insured employer or having your first large self-insured employer is something that's very meaningful. And so figure out what those milestones might be, and we're happy to talk to you about what they are for your company during office hours and all that.
Yeah, so just before you leave that slide, there's a difference if you're a company that's a services-based company versus a company that's going to be delivering some hardware to a consumer versus a company that's really a software advertising-based model. So you really have to think about your milestones and think about your business model and figure out which are the most important milestones for that business, which is why we constantly get to the answer, it depends. Think about your business and really where you believe the value is being created in your business. And that's something you're going to have to talk to Abhas and talk to me when you come ask us for funding. So that's what we're going to be asking you. And we're going to be digging through and saying, why do you think that creates value? So when you're pulling all these milestones together, really ask yourself those questions. Get your best buddies to turn around and be a skeptic and say, why? Why is that a good milestone? And you might change your mind. It's all an iterative process, which is why it depends.
Sure. Of course, there's some monetization models, so I think this monetization financials are 2 important parts here. One is hitting particular revenue benchmarks, and those are more relevant as you go into Series B and C. stages. But also a second component is understanding if there are multiple revenue streams that exist with your product, it's getting validation of those separate revenue streams is also something that can be an important milestone down the road. Okay, so now that you've established the milestones, you've had multiple conversations with mentors or thought leaders or friends, and you're starting to get a better feel for what your milestones are. Now it's time to sort of take the time and figure out what's it going to take to get there. So how many months of development will get you to this point? How many man hours? How many individuals will it take to get there? What types of individuals do you need to get to that point? So those types of questions start to answer, start to lay out something as simple as a Gantt chart, which is what's sort of modeled at the top here, but which tells you that these are the resources that I need to get from point A to point B. And point B being your next fundraising or your next fundraising, and point A is sort of where you are today or what you're looking to raise. So once you've laid that out and you start to put numbers to each of those different resources, you can now get a good picture of the kind of financing you need from between now and then. So, and let's say this is $5 million. So that takes you to the next example. But you're looking to raise $5 million at your Series A. And what Rowan will do now is talk about why it's important to get it close to right when you're doing your fundraise.
So we've given you two examples. We thought that we'd give you these examples because what you have to do anytime you fundraise is think about how much money you need now for a set of milestones, but try and think about how much money you're going to need in the future. I know that it's really hard to predict the future, and the venture capitalists and funders you're going to talk to are going to be most interested in the detailed milestones for now for this set of money. But from your perspective, and also from their perspective, you should be saying, over the whole life cycle of this company, I think I need $15 million, or maybe I need $20 million, which enables you to work backwards to, again, try and get to, is this the right amount of money now? This is all about modeling. And the other thing you always need to do is just remember, we wouldn't be in this business unless we were optimists. You need to put in a couple of failures or a couple of times when it's going to take you twice the length of time, because it always happens and every startup changes their business model. So make sure you account for that. So the couple of examples we've given here is two companies that raise $15 million each. One of them raises it in 3 sets of $5 million because they're very nervous about taking too much dilution at any one time. The second company has said, well, I'm just going to raise it in two rounds. I'm going to take $10 million now because I'm nervous I'm not going to have enough cash. So this is the balance, too much dilution, too much cash. But they've both raised $15 million. As you can see, the valuations we've put on these companies, we've given them a $10 million for the first round, both of them exactly the same valuation. One of them raises $10 million, one of them raises $5 million. The one that raised $5 million has got an intermediate round of a $25 million pre-money valuation for their second round when they raise another $5 million. And then they've gone to $50 million and raised a third set of $5 million. The second company has got exactly the same valuation at the last round. They have $50 million valuation. And we've kept the option pools constant because option pools matter. Look at the founder's share in the two examples. That's a pretty big difference as a founder. The VCs are going to be doing this for themselves, but what we're trying to give you the example of is you should really model this out. Model this round, model the next round. You won't be right. I can assure you you won't be right, but you'll get a feel and it will make you really think, do I need to hire 10 engineers for my plan?
Sure.
Or do I need to hire 5 at this point? And it's important to everybody. The example I like to give about fundraising is thinking about yourself as a farmer. And you might say, well, that's so antiquated and non-high tech. Think of yourself as a farmer. You've got an acre of land that is completely unploughed, and there's a cave in there, and there's a river in there, and it's pretty fertile soil. That's really where you are right now in your startups. You can go and you can own that whole piece of land yourself and go and break your hoe, break your pick doing it. Or you can hire other people, including venture capitalists, to help you plough that land. What really matters is how productive that land is in the end. So how big is the pie from that land? So by yourself, you might be able to grow 10 sunflowers, but with other people, you might be able to grow 100, and it's much more worth growing 110. So that's the way to constantly think about it, is how do I get this whole piece of land to be most productive? How much money and how much help do I need to get it there? And that's exactly the same true for hiring your venture capitalists and hiring your employees and hiring your advisors. Constantly think, how does this fit into the bigger picture? So the bottom line is raise how much you think you need and try and get it right, but give yourself a little bit of flexibility. So I'd say the common thing I have to say to companies is they say, we're going to get to this milestone in Q2 2013, so we're going to raise 18 months' money. And I say to them, okay, so when are you running out of money? And they say, May 29th, 2013. I say, okay, so I think you're probably either going to run out of money a bit earlier than that, or it's going to take a bit longer. And have you scheduled in enough time to actually go and raise money? You need at least another 3 months past your last milestone. So make sure you factored that in when you're figuring out how much to raise.
Great. So next question that we were asked is, how are digital health companies valued?
How are digital health companies valued? That's a great one. Well, it depends. How are social media internet companies valued? Can anybody think of one with a great value? I can. Facebook. Are they all valued like Facebook? No. How are search engine companies valued? Google. No, they're not all valued like that. So what we've given you is an example of a couple of companies who have had a tremendous fundraising path, ZocDoc and Practice Fusion. I think we should be viewing them as the Google and the Facebook of digital health right now. We all want to be those companies. We also have to realize there's 100, 1,000 companies that don't get this ramp in valuation. These are the picture-perfect valuations. So you can see both ZocDoc and Practice Fusion had a seed and a Series A in the sub $50 million pre-money valuation, which is where I'm guessing that you'll all be. And if you're not, I'd love to know about it. I'd love to know about it, because can I invest now? But at Series B, both of them then raised money at Series B to really, I think in both of the cases, it was to drive commercialization and revenue. So that by the time they got to Series C, they'd got proven traction, proven revenue, and that's why they managed to raise money at such high valuations in Series C. They certainly raised a lot of money earlier, and you can see from Series A to Series B, it was probably a 2x change in valuation, which is a very healthy and respectable change in valuation. So I think most of you at the seed stage, what you're probably going to do when you raise money is raise money without setting the valuation. And you'll get different answers from different people with venture capitalists and angels as to whether you should be setting the valuation now. I think if you're at a very low valuation and you need to raise $1 or $2 million, it's a very dilutive event for you as the founders of the company. So what people will often do is, for small amounts of money, will allow you to set the valuation at the next round price with some discount. So for example, you may raise $200,000 from an angel at a 10% discount to the next round. What does that mean? So if your pre-money valuation was $2 million and you raised $200,000, you'd be giving up about 10% of the company. However, if you raised it at a discount to the next round, and let's say you raised it at a 25% discount to the next round, and the next round was a $5 million post, you'd be giving up 5% of the company. Easy maths to do. I think you can understand how I'm doing that maths. What most people who give you a unpriced round will do is put some cap on it. And that's fair. So they'll put some cap, like a $4 million cap or a $5 million cap. So they know they're getting at least 5% of the company. At a valuation below that, they'll get more of the company. At a valuation above that, they'll still get 5%. So you'll often see those kind of terms in a seed term sheet. At the later stages, when you're getting to the Series A and Series B, the valuation is very much dependent on what milestones you've hit, whether you're generating revenue, how much competition there is for the deal. Honestly, it's like in that case, it is like buying a house. How much competition there is for the deal, it does change the price. I never want to say that a VC financing is like buying a house, because it isn't. And also what your competition or who you can point to. So you're always trying to help the VCs and the angels understand who you're comparable to. Because what you have to understand is the people you're talking to are not as expert as you are in your particular company. But they do see a lot across the field, so they'll be constantly trying to map it to something they know.
So Rowan, so often you'll hear, and we say the same at MDV sometimes, that we're looking for a particular percentage ownership in a company. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for a startup at a Series A, or I guess a Series A? Yeah.
Yeah, and that really gets down to, well, how much money are you raising, and who are you raising it from? If you're raising it from a big funds will want to take a board seat. And to take a board seat, the big fund has to have a certain percent of the company, because for 5% of the company, the individual partner is probably not going to take a board seat in your company. And there's pros and cons for you. Maybe you want that person as a board member because they'll have a fiduciary responsibility to you. And there's a whole set of responsibilities that come with having being a board member in a company. They will spend more time focused on your company and introducing you and helping you if they're a board member. On the other hand, from their perspective, if they own too little, they can't spend that amount of time, because it's really not scalable being a board member, because it's your time. You can only do a certain number of companies. So there will be certain minimum requirements. We're often looking for 20% of a company. If you're looking for an investor that's a pure financial investor versus an early stage investor, they'll often won't take a board seat and will be happy with taking 3% of a company, but you probably won't get any attention. So that's the trade-off and the balance.
Great. Okay, so next question then is, term sheets are very complex pieces of paper. So tell us a little bit about what are some of the standard deal terms.
So again, it depends. So if you can click to the next slide. I think probably all of you know this already, but I thought I'd just remind you, there's generally two particular types of stock in a company. There's common stock and there's preferred stock. As a founder in the company, you will have common stock. And the investors probably don't want to buy common stock from you unless it's a very specialized case like a Facebook secondary market. Then people will buy common stock. So, but at this stage of investing, the investors are looking for preferred stock. And you might say, why? What's the difference? Well, with preferred stock, there's additional rights because the investor is paying a higher price for that stock. I'll take an example. The valuation of the common stock may be 10 cents a share, and the investor may be paying $1. But what they're paying the dollar for, it doesn't mean that they own a higher percent of the company for their particular share, but they have rights. And the kinds of rights they're looking for is to get their money back after they've invested in you. So you have your liquidation event, the company gets sold. The investor wants to get their money back first because they've basically invested the money at a higher price than the 10 cents a share. They're also looking for rights maybe in an anti-dilution scenario. And these are all different terms that I can talk you through. And often you'll see rights around dividends. So preferred stock often has a dividend, which is, you should think of it a bit like difference somewhere between a bond and owning an equity in the public markets. So preferred stock is somewhere in between there. Can
you talk about are there different classes of preferred stocks? Or what's the difference between a stage A or a Series A investor and then sort of a Series B, let's say another company comes in?
Yeah, so this is where, again, the answer is it depends. So you tend to, in term sheets, you will see things where it will talk about the preferred stock voting as a class, or it might be voting as a Series A class or a Series B class. And sometimes the rights between the classes are exactly the same, and sometimes they're different. So what I want to do is go to the next slide to talk about some of the deal terms, and really depends on what stage you are and whether this is the first money in or the last money in. And again, you've got Michael, I believe, helping you from the legal side, and he would be able to talk you through any of these terms and give you advice. So what we did here is take a term sheet and pull out the set of terms. And then I reorganized it like this, because it doesn't look like this in a term sheet. I reorganized it into the buckets, the sort of practical buckets. So the cap table, that'll be in your term sheet. You will have a copy of the cap table in your term sheet or the proposed cap table. And that's where valuation and price per share and the size of option pool will all be defined. And the way the venture capitalists are looking at it, you've probably heard this before, it's like a pizza. So if it's a $20 million post valuation and the venture capitalist is putting in $5 million, well, 5 divided by 20. So they're going to be in the 25% ownership. And then depending on the size of the stock option pool, if the stock option pool is 25%, then the founder's share is 50%, because it's 50 plus 25 plus 25. You don't calculate it as, or investors will very rarely calculate it as this is the founder's share, I then own 25%, and we put the stock option pool on top, because that screws up the percentages. It's basically, constantly think about it as a cake or a pizza, and then you'll understand how the VCs are thinking about it. We like food. The next category around decision-making and information, I put these terms into this chunk because practically they're all about how the company is run and what happens in a board meeting. They're all about how do you vote to approve the budget of a company. Well, it kind of depends on the composition of the board. And it kind of depends how many people on the board are representing preferred stock and how many are representing common stock and how many are independent. So there's going to be all these numbers in a term sheet about, oh, it's a 60% voting threshold, it's a 75% voting threshold, it's a 63% voting threshold. It all depends on the composition of the board and the composition of the stock. And VCs pay a lot of attention to what those numbers are, and therefore you should. You should go and understand why a voting threshold has been set at a particular place, because there's a reason. The information rights. An investor in your company has the right to see the information, to see how much money you have, to audit you. Often that's just done at the board level. They're not really going to be auditing you, but at least VC investors probably won't. But they will be asking for information every quarter, because guess what? We have investors in us that we have to report to, so we have to report what you're doing to our investors. Board meetings will probably be defined in a term sheet. We are going to have a board meeting every 2 months or every 3 months or every 1 month. Again, that will be in the term sheet. And there'll be a set of protective provisions which are really around changing the rights of a class of stock. And I put that under decision making. It could easily fit in the future financings category as well. Founder terms. The VCs will require you to sign a confidentiality agreement with your own company. Yes, we'll make sure, we'll say we're not investing until you've signed your rights over to the company. Because I think the thing that everybody forgets is once you're in a partnership with a VC, it's all about the company. It isn't about the VC or about the founders, it's about the company. So the VC members sitting on your board, they're not representing their VC, they're representing you, the company. And it's much more like a marriage than buying a house at that point. If you're talking about valuations and buying a house, well, you as the seller want to get the highest possible price, and me as the buyer wants to get the lowest possible price, and then we're never going to see each other again, I hope. Because with a VC investment in a startup, it's like a marriage. You're sitting on the board of these companies for 5 years. You're going through sickness and health. Sometimes the company's doing well, sometimes the company's doing badly. It's really you're working together to try and figure out the right thing for this marriage, for this plot of land that you're growing as many crops on as possible. It's really like a marriage. So that's why with the VC is going to ask the founder to not have vested all their options. If the founder owns 25% of the company and is the key to making that company successful, if all of that is completely vested, the founder can just walk away and leave the VC and say, oh, I own 25% of the company, and leave the VC to run it. It's not very good for you or the VC, honestly. So that's why these kind of terms come into term sheets. Future financings. There's all these terms, right of first refusal, pro rata rights, anti-dilution rights. What this is really about is to make sure that the VC who's given you the first $5 million has the ability to participate in a future financing. What they don't want is for you to say, oh, I found somebody else to do this. Sorry, you're going to get diluted. The VC wants to have the right to participate in that, and that's what the pro rata rights are about. Exit events, and these are probably some of the most controversial terms that you will end up discussing with your VC, which is about liquidation preferences. Abhas is going to give you some examples of this. But I want to take a moment, take a step back from being controversial. Every time you get a term sheet from a VC, you should sit down with them in person and talk through every single term in that term sheet and understand why they put it in, what it means for you, and what it means for them. Because I sort of generally live by this. Assume noble intent. So it's assume that the VC has done it for a reason, and they haven't done it for a reason to somehow slit your throat, because that's not the intent. I personally never send a term sheet to a company unless I've talked them through it first. I just won't put it in the email and say, here's a term sheet. I will print it out. I will make the effort to go and sit with them, say, this is why I've put the terms in, and answer any questions. And they may push back on things, and that's fine. Or I say, just go and talk to your lawyer. Go and try and understand it. And this, again, with all of these deal terms, this is where you should use your lawyer. And the lawyer will say, well, you know, that's a bit standard. That's pushing a bit much. There's always some to and fro, but that's all of these terms are in there for a reason. And particularly early stage versus late stage, a lot of the terms really change. So if you've got a VC putting in late stage terms in an early stage deal, there's something wrong too. So if a late stage term would be if a large liquidation preference, that's just not appropriate for an early stage deal. So.
Okay, so the next question is about option pools. How much do you give to advisors? How much do you give to employees? And so there's a spectrum. So first of all, we talked about option pools vary between 10 and 20%. This is at the Series A stage. And so we talked about look at what your needs are. So if you've got a hiring plan for your next, between your current position and your next raise, think about who are the different individuals that you're going to need to get from point A to point B. There are pretty standard tables out there about what percentage of options is standard for that particular individual or somebody with that title. And so you can start to figure out what's the option pool that you're going to need. Rowan, do you want to comment on what the implications are of getting setting your option pool at 10% or 20%, lower or higher, and what happens if you need more or need less?
Sure. So this option pool is again is really a discussion while you're negotiating with the VC. This is before you've got the term sheet, and it isn't discussing negotiating. It's a bit like before you get married, you might turn around and say, well, are you going to, if you're doing a prenup to get married, how often are you going to wash up? So it's the same kind of thing. I didn't have a prenup. I just got married and said in sickness and health. But, lots of people do that. Does he wash up? He loads and unloads the dishwasher. I guess that counts. Yeah, hadn't thought about that. Yeah. So so again, you're trying to figure out how many people you need. And that's important because it's important for the budget. Because you're paying these people, but it's also important for the stock option budget. So you should look at the stock option budget in exactly the way you look at the financial budget and turn around and say, how many options am I going to need to give during this round of financing? Tends to be probably between nearer 15% in a Series A, and that you have available and free to issue to people. In a later series, it may be less because the employees are taking less risk, so they deserve less of the company at that point. So here, a VP wants 2% to Series A. At a Series C, that VP may only get 0.7 to 1%. You may be hiring a more experienced individual, but they get less of the company because they took less risk. They didn't get in there and use the hoe to hoe that ground. So go and have a look at that. Now, what happens? People always say, well, what happens if I don't have enough? Well, you all take dilution again. And it's you and the VCs take dilution. You're entirely aligned about this. So if you have a 15% option pool and you sort of blow it on the first 5 people, say, I've got to give them all 3%. Believe me, you're going to all take dilution to add more option pools in. And that's why the board approves options, because they want to understand that you're giving appropriate level of options. And you kind of want to know what other competitors are giving, and that's where the board can be helpful. So the other question is, what if my option pool is too big? Well, it tends to roll over into the next financing. You don't have to take that dilution next time, but you all take some dilution because you're probably going to expand it. Happy to answer more questions about this, but this is really important. And I think that people underestimate what the sizes of grants should be for certain individuals and overestimate for others. They tend to underestimate for the key people who are going to be your superstar full-time employees. Tend to underestimate there. Tend to overestimate for advisors. Because you think, there's this fantastic person that I can get into my company and can give me advice. And that person might say, I need 1% of the company. And at this stage, you say, 1%, that's nothing. I would strongly advise you to go and figure out how much time they're going to spend and give them a grant that's appropriate with what level they would have in the company and what % of time compared to a full-time person they're going to be. So that's, I feel very strongly about that. People often make a mistake of handing out 1% here and there, and then the VC looks at the cap table and say, who are all these people on this cap table? Why are they getting all these grants? The other thing that people tend to make a mistake about or don't think about is they think about, well, it's a 4-year grant, 4 or 5 years for employees. For advisors, my recommendation is to think about it as a 1-year grant and give them a quarter of the amount, and then if they're still being a good advisor after another year, you give them another 1-year grant. And these are people who aren't full-time in the company. So, and this is something which I think Hallie and the group can all advise you on.
Yeah. So one important distinction I want to raise, just to build on Rowan's point, is about how the option pool is priced. So the option pool is priced at the pre-money valuation, but granted at the post. So what that means is that you don't want to take a large option pool today and then have this be your option pool for the next 5 years of the company through subsequent raises. What you want to do is set up an option pool that gets you from today till your next fundraise and a little bit of cushion. And that, because what happens is that you're paying for it at the pre-money today, which is expensive. But if all goes well, the pre-money a year and a half from now, when you're ready for your next raise, is much cheaper. So it's cheaper to buy those shares for the option pool. And so that's what you want to do, is really figure out, again, it comes back to you've just got to plan this out really well and recognizing that there's going to be some flux there, but plan it out really well and time it stage by stage. And you can always re-up the option pools at every stage as need be. But if you go in with too much of an option pool, you take out too much of your founder share. And if you don't go on with enough, then you take up too much of your preferred shares as well, and VCs will obviously push back on that.
Yeah. The other thing about option pools that often people forget is you have to set a price for the options, and that has to happen legally once a year. You end up paying somebody, I think it's about $5,000 or $6,000 these days to get what's called a 409A valuation. It used to be 10 years ago that the VCs and you on the board, you'd say, oh, the preferred stock was $1, therefore our options, they're 10 or 20 cents. The problem that happened, actually, I think it's during the late 90s, is the companies were valuing the employees' stock at 10 cents, and right before they went public at $3. And that was wrong because those options should have been much nearer the price that the public markets were paying. So now legally you have to get an external party once a year to take a look at the whole finances of the company and say your common stock price is X. And you and your boards cannot issue options to anybody unless you have a current 409A valuation. Early, your valuation will probably be somewhere around 20% of the preferred price, but late it'll be much nearer 90% if you're making tremendous progress and you're about to do an IPO. So it's just something to remember.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of topics. I think the next few slides are just sort of a smorgasbord of different issues or questions that have been thrown out. And so we'll start walking through each of them. I think we'll start with, what are some of the top fundraising mistakes that you see from startups?
So on the left-hand side, the lack of clarity on milestones and vision. If you haven't heard it already, plan your milestones, plan your budgets, and plan your stock options, and really build yourself a spreadsheet and model it. It's actually a very useful skill to have in running the company, but it's something that a lot of people don't think about. Because if you don't have the clarity, you might raise too little, which means you may end up with a flat round, which wouldn't be such a good thing at the next round, or you may raise too much and take too much dilution. Fundraising too early is another mistake. A classic one that we often get is a company comes in and said, well, I've reached all these milestones, but I've got this great milestone coming in 4 months. The VC will say, great, I'm going to wait till 4 months and see whether you hit it. And they will first of all see, did you hit the milestone and did you hit it in the time frame you said? So that's something you have to be really careful about. Don't go and fundraise too early just because a VC is willing to talk to you. Granting advisors too much equity, I think we've talked about that. People end up giving a lot of the equity away early if they don't plan it. poor self-awareness, know your weaknesses and gaps. I actually heard a great thing on the radio yesterday. It was this underwear, this women's underwear company. Spanx, thank you. I was listening to it on the radio, Spanx. I don't actually know what Spanx are, but I was intrigued. But it was some kind of invisible women's underwear. The entrepreneur founder filed a patent. She went and took out a $5,000 loan and started selling this women's underwear to stores. She's now at something like $1 billion in revenue. I don't know what the number was. She hasn't taken any VC money yet, and she's thinking about it right now. But the thing that she said that I just want to tell everybody to go listen to, when she was asked the question, how did you know it was time to hire a CEO? She said, I knew it was time to hire a CEO because I like to hire to my weakness. She said, I started off by hiring to my weaknesses. I realized I wasn't very good at marketing, so I hired to my weakness. I hired in the marketing. I realized that I wasn't the person that knew all about particular fabrics, so I hired to my weakness. It got to a point where I had the cash flow and the spreadsheets and the tax. I hired to my weakness. I hired a CEO. So I think that was a fabulous thing that she said. So it's the knowing your weaknesses and gaps and hire to it. It makes you a stronger person. And some of the most successful CEOs hire people who are more experienced to them, but they pay more than they even pay themselves. Entrepreneurs are always like, well, I'm the CEO, I should earn most. Not necessarily. Depends who you're hiring. Unrealistic plans is a mistake. Again, if you say I'm going to conquer the moon in a year because you think that's what the person wants to hear, if it's unrealistic, your credibility is reduced. Just try and be as credible as you possibly can, because remember, this is a marriage. Talking to too many VCs concurrently, there's different opinions on this. I personally think you should go and pick the set of VCs that you think are going to be most interested in what you're doing, and then go and talk to that group of people. You want to talk to a few at the same time, because you don't want to have one person turn you down and then the next person, it takes a long time. But choose the VCs. If you go and talk to 20 VCs all at the same time, you'll be talking to some who are not appropriate for you. You need to figure out. So nobody should come and talk to me who has a novel semiconductor technology for building an Intel chip. I am not the right person to talk to. Believe me, I get those emails. And I always kind of question, I'm like, why, did you read my bio? The other ones which are great are, Dear Mr. Chapman. I'm like, okay, you didn't read my bio. So I get that all the time, it's okay. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is, imagine you're marrying the person, or going into a domestic partnership, or imagine you're going to be in a boardroom with this person for the next few years, every 2 months. You have to trust them. It's all about trust in the end. And that's why with the term sheets, it's all about trust. You have to understand why they're doing it. And they have to understand why you want what you want. So you'd better have a good answer. Great.
So the takeaway, trust. It's about trust. I think one point to add to that is about, so it sort of covers a lot of these, is that being very transparent about what your concerns are about the relationship with the venture firm, about the risks that are associated with the company itself. I think that's one thing that really endears me to some of the startups that we see, is when they're very clear about the hurdles that they're going to face, or the gaps that they have in their leadership. Those are great, because it shows self-awareness, and that's something that it's so important, and it's something that you can sort of work with an individual to better understand what you can do to help them out. But I think the flip side of that is that someone isn't transparent about the risks, and you find out in your due diligence that something that's a glaring fault in this company exists. There's a regulatory change that's going to happen in the next 6 months or the next year and a half that's going to eliminate this opportunity. Those are the types of things that you want transparency on, and when a red flag like that comes up, you basically end the diligence right there, whether it speaks to the total opportunity or not, but it speaks to a lack of trust in the relationship. So.
There is a process. I mean, the way I always talk to entrepreneurs that I'm about to enter a diligence process with, I say, think of it like this, like an onion. Shouldn't make you cry, but the idea is it's a layer. I don't want to know your innermost secrets right now. I want to understand the first layer, and then we'll get to the next layer and the next layer. With intellectual property, if I'm going to ask you to do intellectual property diligence right up front, that's not appropriate. Because intellectual property gets very sensitive between a company and a VC. I should be asking that near the end of my diligence. Talking about market opportunity and team, we should be talking about that right now. And then let's move to the next layer and the next layer. And just be as transparent as you can during that process. But don't send me all of your patents before I've even started doing diligence. It's just the wrong time and the wrong place. So.